From the very beginning, the T90 transmission has always had a problem with second gear popping out and synchronizers wearing out. I'm going to try to walk you through today all the different things that can be wrong with second gear and why that is the gear that causes all the problems in the T90 transmission. First, this is your main shaft. Your main shaft is the central portion of the transmission. The first reverse slide gear slides on it. We're going to take that off. I just wanted to leave it on there for a moment to show you where it goes. But for clarity for the rest of this operation, we're going to take it off. Okay, this is your main gear. This is your second gear. Okay, your second gear fits onto the main shaft like this. Now, sometimes the problem with second gear can be that this is worn out. If someone has run the transmission without oil, it will burn up this bushing inside here. If they've run it without oil, it can burn up and melt this portion right here on the main shaft and on the back of the second gear. Second gear should fit firmly on the shaft. It'll have just a tad of wobble, and that's okay because you need a little bit of clearance, but that's all you should have on there. Alright, if either of those issues is a problem, you're going to be having problems with second gear. In front of the second gear fits your synchronizer blocking ring. When these wear out, they'll fit almost firmly up against where these chevrons are. If you're worn out to that point, actually anytime you take the transmission apart, unless it's a brand new transmission, you should replace these synchronizers. They're fairly inexpensive, $5–6 a piece, and I always recommend replacing them. Make sure that it's lubricated also. But this is going to fit on here. This, as it rides along, inside this clutch hub will fit on here, and this will slide around inside it. Now, this will be locked to the clutch hub by the synchronizer springs and plates. When it's locked together like that, this is going to spin. Now, what happens is the synchronizer blocking ring will be spinning, the second gear will be sitting still. As it forces its way up, this beveled area with all the little grooves cut in it will ride on this smooth area right here. As that happens, it will start to catch and it will grab, and now second gear will begin to turn with it, allowing the clutch sleeve to slide over. With the blocking ring installed on second gear, it should fit so that the chevrons will be able to line up. Okay. Your clutch sleeve and clutch hub assembly then fits on. And your synchronizer springs have to line up with the notches in the blocking ring. When they do, they'll lock together like that. Okay. Once all that is together, then the only thing left to do is install the snap ring on the front. With the snap ring installed on the front, second gear is now locked in place. You should not be able to move second gear any more than about this amount. This is just about the maximum of the looseness allowed. Alright, if you can move it more than that, it's probably going to wobble around too much and you're going to have problems with it popping out of gear. Alright, but this one fits good. It's got a good bushing. There's not a whole lot of wobble. Now what should happen is this main gear is now going to fit inside the transmission. There's a bearing spacer at the back. Slides on here. Then over all this we're going to have the bearing retainer and then the bearing. Now the bearing is going to have to be press fitted on. It will fit down onto the gear. It'll just all go together pretty much like this. Now let's talk about what can go wrong. If this main bearing begins to wear out, what happens is the central cage on it will now move fore and aft inside the bearing. If it moves fore and aft inside the bearing, it allows the main gear to move fore and aft. Now if the main gear is allowed to slide fore and aft, what's going to happen is if it slides aft, the shift fork is only going to be able to push the clutch sleeve so far back, and it's going to end up leaving a gap right here. What's going to happen then is these small teeth that are supposed to line up and slide up inside the clutch sleeve are only going to be partially engaged. Okay? If they're only partially engaged, now when you downshift or decelerate, what's going to happen is the counter shaft is rotating in one direction because the engine's applying power to it. Okay, as soon as you go to let your foot off the gas, now you're using brake torque, engine brake torque. So what the pressure is now coming from the opposite direction through the gear train, which reverses the pressure on this helical cut gear. Well, when that happens, it shifts everything and boom, you pop out of gear. All right, so you want to make sure that your main shaft is only allowed to move very little at all. And so a cure for it back in the day was when this bearing would begin to wear, what they would do is they would open up the back of the transfer case and they would loosen this nut, okay? With the nut released, they would take a brass rod and they would drive the main shaft forward as far as they could get it to go. Okay, what that would tend to do is it would open up because this bearing is locked in the bearing retainer. It can't move forward with that shaft. It then opens up a gap right here. Okay, when that gap opens up, they would take and shim it whatever distance that gap opened up to right here. So you only need to do that if your rear bearing is really worn. In addition to that, I would think that the easier thing to do would be to go ahead and replace the bearing. However, in order to replace that bearing, what they have to do is separate the transfer case from the transmission, take it out, and go to all that. So what they would do instead, they would drive this forward, and they had it was like a C-clip that they would make or buy, and it would snap in around here, and then they would tighten the nut back down, and that would clamp it in place against the gear, and that would stop it. All right, so they didn't have to change the bearing, and they could get another 30, 40, 50,000 miles out of the transmission that way without replacing the bearing. Okay, so you should never have to shim too many brand new transmissions unless there's a real issue going on here with your shaft. For some reason your shaft isn't the right length or too small. But for a rebuild, if you replace the rear bearing, this issue for your second gear popping out should go away. However, there's been a lot of transmissions that were rebuilt. People put them all back together and they still popped out of second gear with all new bearings. They would replace the second gear. They would replace the synchronizer assembly, and it would still pop out of second gear. And they're baffled. What do I do from there? Well, that's what we're going to cover the rest of today. Okay, but this here is where you would put that. And what you would have to do in order to use this shim technique is take the tower off, open up the back of the transfer case, loosen the nut, drive the shaft forward, measure your distance, and put in a snap shim that goes in there. All right, that's if you wanted to shim the rear. If you're doing a rebuild, you shouldn't need to do that, but that's how you would correct that if that's the problem. If, however, you loosen that nut and you drive that shaft forward and you don't get any clearance right here, well, I'm thinking you got a different problem. So let's proceed on and see what we can find out with that. Here we have a freshly rebuilt T90 transmission. Now what happened with this, everything in here meets all the tolerances as it's supposed to. However, when we put the shift tower on it and shifted it into second gear, then removed the shift tower, what we found was this gap right here for second gear, which means that the synchronizer sleeve was not sliding all the way back into second gear. Now, is it capable of getting there? Yeah, it'll slide right in. But the shift tower was preventing it from making it all the way in. So let's talk about what was causing that. This is a shift tower that was not rebuilt. It was just put on the transmission to check it out, see if the operation of the transmission was good. And what we found was it wouldn't go all the way into second gear. Well, the culprit behind that is this shift fork right here. See how much motion there is in this shift fork? This shift fork is supposed to be held in place by a locking pin back here. I don't know if you can see that very well. Let me put a little extra light on it, see if it helps. Okay, there's a locking pin here. Okay, what I did to eliminate this problem was I drove out that locking pin and replaced it with a roll pin. With the roll pin installed, now we haven't finished this transmission, this shift tower yet. This is a different one, but we haven't changed it yet. But with the roll pin installed, there is no motion of that, and it now allows it to go in and out of gear all the way. It now slides all the way in. It ends up being about 2/1000ths of an inch from being fully flush, and there's about 2/1000ths of an inch wear on the shift fork. So I think we're good. Once it's in gear, let's talk about a little bit of something else. Once it's in gear, what holds it in gear? Once the clutch sleeve is locked into gear, a lot of people are of the impression that the synchronizer plates inside the synchronizer, like this one, will hold it locked in gear. Well, that's not true. The only thing those plates will leave locked in is when you go to neutral position. That's its neutralized position is neutral, and even then there's still a fair amount of play in and out of that gear. All right, so what is going to hold second gear locked in? Well, what holds it is the detent springs in the shift tower. I took a shift tower apart yesterday, and it felt good when I shifted through it. It seemed to pop in and out. Everything seemed to be working fine, but when I took it apart, this is what the springs look like for the shift tower poppet balls. All right. Well, obviously the top half of the spring was the only part that was still working. The rest of it was sitting up inside there with a lot of rust jammed in place. So this part of the spring here was all that was working. The rest of it was all snapped off laying inside there. This poppet ball is what's supposed to hold you into second gear. So first off, you need to get the gear to go all the way in to lock in place. Once it gets all the way in, then you release the shifter. The shifter's going to drop back just a hair, and that should hold you locked in second place until you pop it out with the shifter cane again. If you've now done all of the things that we've talked about, you've checked your rear bearing spacer, you've tried to push the main shaft forward, you've checked your fit of the second gear, you've checked your synchronizer clutch sleeve fit, and you still can't get it quite where it's supposed to be. You shift it into second gear and you take off the shift tower and you're still not up against second gear. What do? You've changed your poppet balls, you've checked the fitting on the cane here, you've checked that, you've checked the wear on your fork, the faces of your fork, you've checked all those things, and you still can't get it to go all the way up against the second gear. Now what do? Well, there's one last thing that you can try that should get you there. If you'll notice in the shift tower, right here, there's a detent boss. Can't see it very well. Let's try to put a little more light on it. That's too much light. Okay. See that detent right there? All right. Now, what happens is your shift fork, this boss on the shift fork right here, rides up against that. That's the stop for second gear. Okay, if you tried everything else and you can't get anything else to work, what you can try doing is shaving a few thousandths off of that stop or stop in here. That should get you that last little bit that you need to get it all the way into second gear. If you try all those things, put them all together, I'm pretty sure you're going to come up with a good solid fit and a second gear T90 transmission that will not pop out. If you have any difficulty, feel free to contact me. I'll be happy to help as much as I can. Thank you.